rolls and Jolly Ranchers for like 3 cents, so
Yeah.
maybe 5 cents. Inflation.
Regardless, I'm just saying that a
Big
couple
money.
cent candy makes more sense
Than
when you're
big.
selling a Tootsie Roll than it
Yes.
does when you're buying Tootsie Rolls.
Yeah. Same things with berries, we had berries growing on the wild on the property.
It takes so much money.
Yeah, by the time you got one back, it'd be done.
Well, we never made money on blueberries, but
You okay?
we always look forward to blueberry season when we go out. Well, we got to keep all the berries we pick. We would go out and pick rows and rows and try to get a couple buckets of blueberries and then eat them the whole time. So that's all we would have for breakfast. And we would go home with many blueberries for lunch. And then we'd have them with our dinner. So by the time the next day we'd already eaten 2 gallons. We'd think we need more.
Well,
I love diarrhea.
I always dislike blueberries here because they
Yes.
make them so
It's 'cause-
easily.
yeah. But you also have to ruin the bushes to do that.
They don't grow in the bushes, they grow blueberries every year.
You said, you told me that they had to put it, that it messed up the bushes and they had to fix them.
Blueberries like a very acidic soil.
You and I have very different memory of this.
Dad, I'm going to be perfectly honest and say I've never gone to Maine to go blueberrying. So your memory of it is probably better than mine. I only have the memory of the conversation we had where I asked if it damaged the bush.
That's-
And you said yes.
That's the difference that you and I have in memory. It's not the
Well-
berries, it's the talking about the
The
berries.
low bush berries, they come back every year, so after they harvest the fields, they burn the field.
Yeah, they burn, yeah, they do, they burn.
Seth,
the
did you
field.
tell me,
You have to like grow back.
I lost it? Never mind.
That's okay. Now, when I was a kid, we used to go out and rake blueberries, and here people don't understand that, but we had a little rake, it's about this big, and the handle comes up this way, you just go down into the bare bush and pull it up, and it just comes up full of blueberries.
Oh, okay.
But you get
and-
all the ripe green, everything,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
at
you
once.
get it all together, you put it in boxes, and they take those boxes and they put them in front of a fan, and the fan blows all the twigs and the leaves out of it.
Okay.
And then they put it on a conveyor belt, and there are people who pull out all the green berries. They don't throw them away, because they actually use the green berries for things.
Like if
They
you buy
separate them on a conveyor belt.
a blueberry muffin mix that says real Maine wild Maine blueberries, they're almost all those green berries.
Mhm.
They
So
have been what,
They
like,
can them, and they put them
Okay.
in little cans, and, you know, they put like a
They turn-
few of the blue ones in there, but it's mostly the green ones. And I guess when they're canning them, they also put sweeteners in and stuff, so I guess it
Okay.
doesn't matter if they were green, I don't know. The green ones have more pectin, so they thicken the jelly stuff that they do with them.
Interesting.
They don't
But
really
now-
have flavor of blueberry though, do they? Well, they're
Oh,
awfully sour.
Yeah, they still have the, they maintain the flavor pretty well, but the thing is nowadays, they have harvesters, big harvesting
machines.
tractors that drive and just, they have these big, long rigs, and they just drive over the fields of blueberries and just pull up, so. We always got, I usually made about $5,000 in about 3 weeks raking blueberries as a kid.
Usually as a kid, you mean as an older teenager.
As a teenager. Now, nobody gets to do that anymore. It's very sad to me.
That's why we have labor shortages. Machines taking away your job, breaking blueberries.
That's right.
Where's your husband tonight?
He will be here a little bit later, but he is not quite off of work yet.
I don't remember what his name is.
His work is fun. 'Cause today he got to take his clients to a Halloween party, so he sent me a picture of his work, and he's like in his Halloween costume, sitting at a table drinking root beer. And I'm like,
Who are his clients? Are we allowed to know, or for which company does
he
he
works for Archeo Judge.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah,
like, I don't know
Yeah, I
his
did go live
clients'
in the
names or
building
anything,
today.
but-
okay. I think he wouldn't work. No.
Oh, yeah, you
Same,
mentioned
Mike.
that, you said like someone was wrong with the walk. How? I was
I think
just
I-
wondering if
I
it would be
feel-
in flight for me to get more food.
There's lots of food, go ahead.
No, it's light for you to get as much food as you want to eat.
Excellent, you might regret saying that possibly.
Look,
No,
my
it's
nephew
there.
works for Arc of the Ozark in, Springfield, he's a
Isaac really likes working there.
supervisor,
So did you
you
see
know,
about people
over.
working on stream? So you probably wanna start.
His name is Austin Bryan.
Did you tell them?
He works in the Springfield stores. He's over several houses or. He used to be, you know, an in-home, I mean, who would supposedly.
Red does not have second word roads.
Mine did.
Maybe that's the one that I could know as well.
I get
Grow
it.
potato.
Yeah, he has, when he was working more individually, he was like over a group home. So he was in housing, but now he's about here around. I'm sure he's probably, yeah, he's happy with it and he's always like working with, disabled kids and now with the disabled adults. And that's my other part-time job is for disabled adult practice staff. Oh, goodness, there is even that. Okay. Somehow I got mashed potatoes all over my face here and I can't tell if I'm getting them off or
You're good.
making it worse.
You're getting it.
I probably
Making
feel
it worse.
happy to know that we're recording it.
Yes, I'm sure.
You're not recording this part.
Well, maybe they are, I don't
think we're
know,
just
I've
recording
made
the whole
quite a
thing.
mess here. But I think that was so good, Miss, Jessica, you're gonna have to have another piece.
Yeah, that was
That was
very, very
really
good.
delicious.
Well,
Baby
it was
Carol
better to
was-
taste good than to have it look like the Pinterest version, so there you go.
Well, I didn't see the Pinterest one, but I thought it looked good. I thought it looked like a cute little cake in a cake
Okay.
I did too.
That's our Jekyll and Hyde imposter food.
Do you think it's nice cake, but it's really flesh?
That's exactly what I was thinking. I think one would make it work with the Pinterest version of that, to make it a little less moist, so it didn't fall to pieces and then.
And it wouldn't taste as good.
Cool the whole thing down. You do it such a big version.
You know, when people put those things on Pinterest, they usually have to make it like 3 to 5 times first, and they take out all the versions that don't look as good and just show their special masterpiece version that accidentally turned out well. So, you should never feel bad about not making your thing look like the Pinterest version, because they spent way too much of their time on it.
I did actually end up making something that was in a magazine, and it turned out so pretty. I did, for the first time ever, take a picture of
Nice.
something that I had made.
Well, people eat with their eyes first.
It was like an apple cranberry pie, you know, with the little leaves cut out of the pie dough along the top. I don't know, it was just, it turned out, I was so pleased with myself.
My little sister really likes to bake. And she's got
Which sister is that?
Martha. And she does all kinds of fun things with cake decorating that she's learned. I have a picture on my phone somewhere of she made my little brother's birthday cake. So it's a cake and then it's got M&Ms on it. And the M&Ms are going up into a cup that's like floating here. So it looks like it's been dumped out and all the
Oh, wow.
all the
Neat.
candy
That's
is
fun.
falling out onto the cake. And it was so cool. I was like, where'd you learn to do that? She's like, oh, I was watching a baking show and they did it, so then I did it. And I was like, you're like 4, how do you do these things?
No, she's 13.
That's like 4. She's just a baby, okay?
Alright, I think we should probably.
So
get
I wanna,
started.
yeah, I wanna just welcome you all here for our first book club. And we're hoping to do this every month, and we'll release the name of the book on the website, so you'll be able to go on and see what our next books are gonna be. I know for December, I'm really hoping to do A Christmas Carol, although we may also talk a little bit about a couple of Charles Dickens' short stories. He has a bunch of Christmas stories, and A Christmas Carol is just the most famous one, but he actually has a bunch of Christmas stories. So for December, that will be what we'll discuss, is Charles Dickens' Christmas, with an emphasis on A Christmas Carol. Tonight,
I know this date is kind of inconvenient on Halloween weekend. There's a lot of things going on for people, but I think we anticipate that over time.
there will be more, a bigger participation. We do have some people who are watching live. This is streaming, and there are some people that are watching, and for those of you who are watching.
So is the way the camera's set up is for us to be in those chairs there, or for you to? be
No,
there?
it's just set up so they can see everybody.
Awesome.
So, and for those of you who are streaming this live, this is our first time, so hopefully we'll, as we go back and look at it, Seth and I will figure it out and do better each time until we get it really, really good. So today we're going to talk about The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think I chose this book because it's short. Because I could have chosen many, and I would say probably Dracula is my very favorite horror book, and it is probably one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. But this book, I think, is, in my opinion, maybe one of the 3 perfectly written books. So I can tell you why in a little bit, but I'm actually going to turn the time over to Jessica, and she's going to lead our discussion about The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Okay, but as we discussed, we're actually gonna first have you introduced by talking about, why don't you tell the story?
Oh.
Tell us a story about how you first came to start using literature as a therapeutic tool.
Yeah, I totally forgot that we had talked about that. Yes. So I use literature. So I'm a life coach, for those of you who don't know. I have been a therapist for years, and I transitioned into life coaching about 5 years ago. But when I was training, and I was actually going to school in Springfield at Forest Institute of Professional Psychology, and I was assigned in my rotations to meet with a woman who was dealing with depression. And she would come in, her friend would bring her to my office, and she would sit down on the couch, and then the friend would leave, and as soon as the friend left, she would curl up onto the couch in like the fetal position and just lay there. And there I was with this client for 45 minutes and I had to try to figure out how to help her. And I was, probably 6 months into my training. I had no clue what I was doing. And so I would sit there with her and I would talk with her, and she would occasionally grunt, but I don't think in the first 2 meetings that she said a single word to me. And she came in for the 3rd session, and her friend who brought her in told me she's been suicidal and we're really worried about her. And this was on a Friday, and I said, so we worked it out with the friend that she would come back again on Monday. So I thought, I need something for this person to be able to do over the weekend that's going to keep her alive. And I had no clue what to do, so on my way into the office that Friday, as I was getting ready to meet with her, my wife was driving me in, and I was telling her, I said, I wasn't giving her any information about the client, but I just said, I have a client who's depressed, and I don't know what to do. Maybe I should give her a book. And so my wife and I talked about books, and my wife is very well read, has
wonderful ideas. So she gave me an idea for a book. It's Book of 1,000 Days by Shannon Hale. And I thought, okay. And so we, on our way into the office, we stopped by Barnes and Nobles and we picked up the book. And I went in my session and I sat with this woman again for 45 minutes. And right near the end of those 45 minutes, I said, you know what? I wonder if you would just read this book. You don't have to read all of it, just read a piece of it, just read a little bit of this book over the weekend and come in next week, maybe we can talk about it. And I kind of had to tuck it into her arm because she wasn't like taking it. And her friend came in and took her away. And I was just nervous all weekend. I was nervous. This is my first client. Somebody told me was suicidal, and I didn't know what I was doing. Well, I came in on Monday, and to my great surprise, she walked into my office on her own. Her friend wasn't with her. She sat down on the couch, sat upright, and before I could even close the door, started talking to me about the book. And she was amazed at this book and how much it related to what she was experiencing. And so I sat there basically for 45 minutes listening to her. And it was wonderful. And over the next about 3 months, we talked about the book, and she related that book to her life, and we talked her through some problems that she had that had really gotten her into this depression. And the culminating thing in this whole experience to me was so wonderful is her doctor, her physician, wrote me a letter. And in the letter, he explained that she had been coming to see him for 10 years. And that she and he described all these physical symptoms that she had. And they had been to all these specialists and heart specialists, lung specialists, brain specialists. And he said nobody could figure out and nobody could get her over these symptoms, where she would have fainting spells and she would have difficulty breathing and she would have all kinds of stuff, headaches. And he sent me this letter it was about 4 months after she and I started meeting. And he said, she's come in with no symptoms. And he said, I don't know what kind of magic you're working over there, but this is amazing. And I thought, I don't know what kind of magic Shannon Hale's working, but that book's amazing. Yeah. And after that, I started using books. I started assigning books to my clients to read. And every time they would come in with life-changing experiences with these books. And it's interesting because it wasn't like I was giving them a book and saying, go read this book and look for this in it. Or go read this book and tell me how you relate to this character. It was, go read this book and come back and tell me what your experience was. And it's been amazing. Now that was what, 2008? So it would have been, since that was 2008 when I gave that first book to that client. 2009. Might have been 2009. 2008, 2009. And since then, I've used many different books with many different clients, and I've just seen what good literature can do for a person's life. It changes your life when you read good literature in a meaningful way. And I assign novels to my clients. I don't assign I don't assign self-help books. I usually don't assign non-fiction books. It's almost always novels. A good story will change your life. And so, having said that, now
we're ready to go.
Give the time back to Jessica so we can actually talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
All right.
I think you should come over here so everyone can see you better, so you can't just leave the discussion to the side.
Side discussion, sidebar.
Sidebars.
There you go.
All right. So, how many of you read the book before coming tonight.
I've read it before.
That's great, that counts. Well, that's great, so,
So let's just start by letting you guys, anybody who wants to, share your experience of your reading of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Stevenson's so good at filling in the background, because that's why I like to reread it, because I end up being back in the late 1800s, and I mean, I could see the staircase, I could see the door, I mean, almost smell the fog, and that's what I base a good book on, is if I can sit, as I'm reading it, I can see myself there.
Yeah, I love
relate
his
to it.
description when he's talking about when they're going into Soho, the street.
Yeah.
And he talks about the fog, and it's dirty, and then it lifts for just a minute, and he's able to kind of describe the scene where Mr. Hyde's house is, where he and the constable are there, you know, looking for Mr. Hyde. And then, as soon as he describes it, he talks about how the fog comes
Just came right back down.
Comes right back down, and then you can't see anything but this dirty, filthy fog. And that's what you're talking about.
Yep.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
This descriptive language.
Very
that he
descriptive,
uses to
very good at
really
it. Like
get
Stephen King. Stephen King's good at that too. That's why I
Absolutely.
like his books.
Yeah.
But Robert Louis Stevenson is real good at it.
Right.
immersive atmosphere.
Yeah.
And you wanted to?
I think the thing that surprises me the most is that Mr. Hyde is small. He's almost described as almost a dwarf. He is a small, but he's got this huge evil within him, and I think that's what surprised me, not the evil, but the fact that Robert Louis described him or created a character that was small. It just continues to kind of surprise me and makes me want to think more about why a smaller man, why not a giant who would have been to me, because I think in a movie, not a movie version of this, but it was a movie that had great literary characters. It had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it had the Invisible Man, it had several things, and in that movie, when Mr. Hyde came out, he was a giant, he was this huge man.
And I think that is almost always our cultural depiction is Hyde is a big monster. And I think the first time I read it, that really surprised me too. I was like, what, he's small?
But it
It's
makes
like-
sense for him to be small in a way because Dr. Jekyll, the whole point of it is that he has built himself up as this big, important, well-liked man, but he has this small bad thing about him that he wants to indulge, and he keeps indulging in it until he becomes that small part of himself, and it becomes all of him.
I like the way you use that word, indulge.
Yeah.
The weird.
Oh, sorry. This was my first time reading it. I had never read it before, and so I was underwhelmed, I guess, a little bit. I think it'll improve on a second reading, and after hearing people speak positively about it. So, you know, I'm not going to be rigid in my first judgment of this book. And the nice thing about it being short is that I will probably reread it. And what I thought was kind of fun is that before I found out we were going to be reading this book, I ended up on one of those lists on the internet that you find, like about literature or something like that, and it talked about how Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde had a twist ending when it was first written. Nobody knew that they were the same person, and so I was glad I had come across that information because it was more fun to read the book with that in mind, and to keep in mind that was how it was written, that you didn't know they were the same person.
Yeah, it's sort of hard, I think, from our perspective now to really get that when you're reading, because we know the characters Jekyll and Hyde from the time we're really small. Maybe we saw a Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes cartoon with Jekyll and Hyde, or like, it's so permeated in our cultural consciousness that you almost can't come to this book not knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you can try to let go of that and try to feel the feelings of the narrators, of Mr. Utterson and Lanyon, and their feelings towards their friend Dr. Jekyll, and their horror as all their suspicions of what they think might be going on between the two characters, and you try to set aside the fact that you already know the ending. I think that really does enhance the feeling of dread that you get.
The weirdest thing for me when I read it for the first time was actually that pop culture idea that I read it and I was expecting it to be like the Looney Tunes cartoon that I'd grown up with, where you would know the whole time and it would be this monster stalking you in the night, this big green guy who was a totally different personality than the person drinking the bottles. And then when I read it, I was shocked because for one thing, you don't even know what's going on with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde until the end of the story, but almost all of it is them going, dude, is he being blackmailed? You know, having this mystery, and then even in the ending, the whole revelation that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person comes across so differently in the book, because in all the shows, it's like it's a totally separate personality that has nothing to do with Dr. Jekyll. It's just that he drinks the potion and the potion makes him evil. Whereas in the book, it's really the same person with a mask on. You know, he's Mr. Hyde. He's just hiding so that he can do things without it reflecting back on the way that people see him, so that he can keep his friends. And then of course ends up ruining his life because you can't be two people at once.
I'm glad you said that, because I think that was probably why I didn't like the book. It was probably because I had that same expectation from, I don't know, like it's almost like from the culture, from how we use it culturally. We focus on this one, really it's just one piece, like on the physical action of the story. And the story is not really the physical action. It's almost more like a mystery, and then kind of has that culture, or I don't know, like the philosophical question at the end when you read Dr. Jekyll's point of view of what's happened. And so I think that is probably why I didn't like it, was because I came into this expecting one thing, and it's told from the point of view of like these two, I thought of them as crusty old men, and like, it wasn't what I was expecting.
And they aren't even being stalked by a horror monster come to chop them up in the night. Like, Mr. Hyde has almost nothing to do with them for the majority of the story. They're just picking up gossip.
And I like how you use the word hide, H-I-D-E, to describe Mr. Hyde, that he was hiding. I hadn't made that connection, so thank you, I like that.
I think that Robert Lewis made Hyde small in stature to emphasize that this was a true scientific breakthrough of splitting a human along their personality lines, and not a freak accident. Because Henry was a tall guy, and he was, you know, a good-looking guy. It's harder for me reading it to imagine drinking a potion and then shrinking down and getting all you in the face and stuff. I can see more of a duality of psyches, that one that Hyde was, or not Hyde, but Jekyll was hooked on trying to discover his darker side because it was there. And he thought that by doing that, by embracing it, he could find a way to better control it.
And if you think of it in that science fiction sort of idea, where it's a scientific concept and not just a
Right.
fantasy idea, is that Hyde is a part of Jekyll. So he's smaller because he's not the whole man.
Thing.
Like Jekyll is the whole person who has good qualities and bad qualities, and Hyde is siphoning off only this one side, and so he's smaller because he's a part of the whole. Yeah, but
Yeah.
rather than being a different version, he's like a segment.
Right. Yeah. But Hyde and Jekyll were never together.
Yeah.
So, they were one and the same.
Yes.
Through the whole book. And I don't know, cause, the author give us a prelude as far as Hyde, or as Jekyll goes in his development of the serum and Hyde. In his first encounter with Hyde in there. Because he had to give Hyde the key. He had to, tell him what some of the ground rules were with the servants and stuff, or he'd never been able to pull it off.
Karen, what about you? Any thoughts about your experience reading the book?
Well, I had the same reaction. First time reading it, thought I wasn't even sure if I had or hadn't, and realized I had not. Glad it was short, so I could get through it, because if not for the book club, I think I would have stopped. But one thing that would have kept me reading is knowing that who Jekyll and Hyde were, because some of the book for me was like foreign language, the words used, and so I understood only in the context that this was a split personality, one and the same person, let me then decipher what I was reading, because half the time I really, just pulling it out of the reading, I would not have understood, so.
I agree, there were parts, and there were some words that, I'm familiar with the word, but the way he was using it was very
Right.
difficult.
Right.
Or there were some words, I was like, I don't really know what that means.
Right,
I had to
so
look
I
it
was
up,
kind of
you know,
translating it,
yeah.
it was kind of like trying to read in a foreign language, or hear, I could understand the context, but what
Yeah.
was.
And I think that's often the
Yeah.
case when it's been a while since I've read Robert Louis
Right.
Stevenson, or, Charles Dickens, or Jane Austen. I find that it takes me a while to almost retrain my brain to follow that language style, because today's writers are very different in the way that they describe things and do things. And I do find that as the book goes on, it gets a little easier and easier for me. And then if I'm reading a lot of that same time period of writing, it becomes much easier.
Sure.
Stevenson's style of writing. This what we're talking about, mid-1800s England, and the English are weird anyway. But they have a beautiful language. I mean, they really can speak elegantly, and it comes through in the book, I think, because all these friends, they're all upstanding gentlemen.
I like the quote, and I'm not even sure who said it, but that hard books teach you to read them by reading them. So as you start a book that's maybe difficult for you, I think there's a lot of temptation to say, I don't understand this, and I'm gonna give it up. But like Anne was saying, as you get through the book, you start understanding more. And when I'm approaching a text that I feel like is above my level as I start and I'm not really getting it, I try to just let myself be okay with the fact that I don't understand everything.
Sure.
And say, what I'm getting out of this will be enough. And for me, it's not usually helpful to say, okay, I have to stop and look up every unfamiliar word or look up every reference I don't understand. It interrupts the flow too much, and I just let myself be okay with the fact that I won't get everything, especially on a first reading, especially of a difficult text, and get what I can out of it, rather than getting bogged down with, oh, I can't understand this, it's too hard for me. And that has allowed me to continue developing as a reader and be able to read harder and harder things, because I don't give up when I start something and I feel like, oh, this is above my level.
And the nice thing is, nobody in here gave up, because when we asked who's read the book, everybody raised their hand, so fantastic. Tony, what about you? Any thoughts?
I probably looked at it a little bit different than, I told Mark, before working at Arc of the Ozarks, I was an investigator for Children's Division for the state, both some individuals that I investigated or worked with that they had well-paying jobs. For instance, there one lady in particular, she was a loan officer at a very prestigious bank. Very beautiful woman, had her whole life planned out before her. She had a young son. She was beautiful. There's just no other. She was a beautiful woman. And she started using meth. And she would say, "Oh, I can stop at any time. It's okay." But when she used it, she became another person. And she ended up losing her big, beautiful house and her son, and was living literally in a chicken coop on a man's property, along with 3 other women. So that's the way I looked at it. I was like, that's a lot of the people. Well, when he said that he got the salts, I was like, oh, that's.
I know those.
Exactly.
I know people who get those.
I know it. I get what he's talking about. But there was a lot of people when I interacted with them, men and women both, who oh, I can quit at any time. But and the other thing is they didn't always know what they were doing when they were doing that. Kind of like Dr. Jekyll didn't really know some of the things that Mr. Hyde was doing, and he'd wake up and he'd be like, you know, like when the stick was broke or the cane was broke, and he's like, oh no, what happened? And then he heard the news, and then he put 2 and 2 together, and I think that's more how I looked at it than.
And I see that in his. There's a point where Mr. Utterson is talking with him and he's worried about him. He says, I'm really worried about you and this Hyde guy. And he says, oh, don't worry about that. I can get rid of Hyde whenever I want. And he truly believes it. He thinks he can do that. And then he goes through the.
And then there's that moment in his narrative where he says he woke up and he looked at his hands, and they were Hyde's hands. And so it's that first moment of like, maybe I don't have control over this situation. Maybe because it's happening without taking the potion at that moment.
Speaks to the book was kind of like an addict's story.
Yeah.
He kept giving his alter ego more power over him than how it started out.
Right.
But he had to do it, he had to keep doing it. And you mess around with Providence enough, you're gonna get bit in the butt.
Yeah. Well, and there's the part that I think is really interesting, and some of you who've worked with me before know the 5 dangerous situations that anybody who's trying to overcome something that they face, and these are the 5 things that almost always will lead to relapse. And I noticed with Dr. Jekyll that he ends up in several of those dangerous situations. So those dangerous situations are, the acronym is BLAST. It's boredom, loneliness, access, sickness, and tiredness. And so when you get into any of those are the 5 situations that are most likely to result in a relapse. And I was thinking about it because specifically when he says after the murder, he says, I determined not to be Mr. Hyde ever again. I was done.
Yeah.
And he said, I did really well for 2 months.
For 2 months.
But you notice the one thing that he says is, I left his clothes, I kept the house, he didn't get rid of the access.
He didn't want to get,
He didn't get rid of the access. He was willing to try, but not enough. He wasn't willing to give up the things that would bring him back into that life. And I find that very fascinating, that he kept the access there. He was also frequently tired.
Yeah, and because some of the other things you don't have control of, you don't have control over the fact that you'll get sick, or that you'll get tired, or maybe that you'll be lonely or bored. But they're worst in combination with each other, right? So if you can limit the things you have control over, and access is the thing you can have the most control over most often.
Right.
then you're less likely for that to combine with one of those other things.
But you can have some control over boredom, right? You can keep yourself occupied in things that pique your interest. Notice how he says over and over, as Dr. Jekyll, he keeps doing things that will impress people and make people, but he doesn't like them. He's not happy because he's bored of his life. But instead of going out and finding something that he could be interested in, he turns to drugs, right? And
That's
exactly what
a
it
lot
is.
of people, another example is a young lady who got in with the wrong crowd, and she ended up going to prison, and she went all the way in the other side of the state, and we tried to set her up so that she could stay there and not come back to the same house, the same people, the same
Right.
friends, the same clothes.
right,
It didn't work. She came back and then she was back in the same predicament because it becomes comfortable and it becomes routine and it becomes the cycle.
right. Right, and also one of the problems that we face with that, right, when we try to keep people away from the access, sometimes then we're putting them into a place where they're lonely. They don't have anybody that they can turn to, that they feel comfortable with. And so really, when we're trying to help somebody to overcome something real severe, it's important for us to remember all 5 of those dangerous situations and to mitigate them as each one of them as much as possible. Like Jessica said, we're not going to mitigate all of them. We're not going to be able to do that. But we can mitigate them, most of them, and some of them we can minimize the effects that they have in our lives. But I think this is a great example. I'm glad that Tony shared that with us. That this is a great example of an addictive behavior.
One of the things I think is interesting about that is that it's easy to see the substance abuse connection, right? Because it is a substance that he's using. But I think on a personal level for all of us, I think that we all have what we might term addictions, whether they're actual physiological addictions. The term seems to apply to all kinds of behaviors or indulgences that
Word indulging
Yeah,
those
that-
bad behaviors.
whatever it is that we feel kind of a compulsion to do things that some part of us would rather not do. And I think all of us experience that. So I think all of us have a Mr. Hyde side. So you don't have to have a substance addiction to feel like, oh, I know that part of me that's the deep, secret, dark part that other people don't know about, that I have less control over than I'd like to.
I was gonna say, when I was younger, I had a time where I was struggling with pornography, and one of the things that's confused me the most about it was that there was a point where I knew exactly how bad it was. I knew how gross it was. I knew how gross it made me feel. I was related to the part, when I read it, I really related to the part in the book where he's looking out the window talking to his friend, and then all of a sudden panics and runs back inside, and they can't contact him again. Because it is such a weird feeling of being like, I know how horrible this is. I know how horribly I feel about these other people who are in these spaces online that I'm seeing these things in. And yet, it's just always there, and it's always haunting you, and you keep going back and back and back and back. So that's one of the things I thought was really accurate in terms of the addiction in the book, is this feeling of once he realizes what he's into, that's the point when he's disgusted with it. He doesn't want it anymore. Mr. Hyde is a criminal, and yet he can't stop being in it, even though he doesn't like it. He doesn't want it anymore at that point.
I think this whole novel was about all our addictions, because every one of us are addicted to our human nature, and our human nature is evil. it will never tell you to do anything good. Everything it ever tells you to do is probably against God. And I think Jekyll was indulging his human nature side.
You know, he was indulging it. What's interesting, one of the things that really interested me about the book, the first time I actually read the book, that was different from what I had anticipated, was that Dr. Jekyll had already been indulging that side of himself in small degrees. He talks about how, even before he was able to separate Mr. Hyde out, he talks about how he was already indulging in these things that were embarrassing to him. He says, I would be embarrassed by these things, and especially as I became an older man, I was embarrassed by these things that I was doing. So this is.
And I think it's really interesting that Robert Louis Stevenson doesn't identify very specifically any of Jekyll's real failings. Like, we see a couple of things from specific incidents with Mr. Hyde, but not most of what Mr. Hyde is doing, and it's very vague about Dr. Jekyll's sins, what his foibles, and I think that's really powerful because it allows us to apply it more specifically to ourselves. I've seen a couple movie versions of this. One of the ones is with Spencer Tracy, and both of the movie versions that I've seen both give Dr. Jekyll specifically sexual indulgence that he's indulging in, and I can see why you would go that way and they want to flesh it out more for a movie, but I think it's more powerful when it's more vague and the individual reader connects more to your own private things.
It's especially actually kind of interesting that he doesn't tell you what he is, because the things we see Mr. Hyde do are mostly kind of violent, but there's no specific implication that violence is the embarrassing thing he's involved in. It almost feels, at least to me, like it is a, what do you call it? Something that's happening because a symptom. Basically that doing the embarrassing thing, especially as Mr. Hyde, and letting go of his reservations that are holding him to being a decent person, are causing other problems. That it's not just the one thing he's embarrassed about anymore. It's that he's doing other bad things because he's dropped his guard, and it's just influencing the rest of his person now.
So I'm, like, in listening to this, I'm thinking about, one thing about the stature of Mr. Hyde that I think it mentioned in the book is this idea that he was so small because he was underdeveloped, starved. You know, Dr. Jekyll had developed himself into the adult that he was, and hadn't, and you know, I think reading through it hadn't, you know, indulged this Mr. Hyde character that was inside of him, and so that's why he was underdeveloped and small. And so now, in listening to what we're talking about, I'm kind of thinking about it, and you know, maybe there's also this idea that he didn't integrate that side of himself into himself. He didn't acknowledge it, he didn't recognize it, and so it was something that he didn't have control over because he didn't make it part of himself. You can use, you know, like, I'm thinking of what Jordan Peterson says a lot about, you can use the difficult parts of yourself, you know, your difficult or weak personality characteristics to be good. Like, a disagreeable person can be assertive and, you know, use that maybe negative personality trait in a good way. And so maybe I'm thinking now about how Dr. Jekyll did not use the, you know, that side of him, that human nature, that side of him that everybody has, in a way that was integrated into his whole person. And so it was something weak, but at the same time, when it came out, when it was fleshed out, it was something he didn't have control over, and he didn't expect that.
Like that kind of that making our weaknesses become strengths idea.
And so you're having the idea perhaps of part of you that's suppressed, and that sometimes, at least in psychology, there's this idea that if we suppress things, that they're likely to come back
Yeah.
later, but we know we wanna conquer the natural sinful side of our natures, and if we believe that just suppressing it doesn't do it, then what do we do?
I think acknowledging
Acknowledging it and
it's
ignoring it.
there is the first thing.
It seems to me like he didn't want to acknowledge it, he didn't want it to be, as you said, he didn't want to integrate it into himself and utilize that and be able to conquer it. He just wanted to separate it out in the sense, well, he couldn't amputate it, like God would have, if your hand afflicts you, then cut it off, but,
I'll tell you what. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
This kind of reminds me just the idea of him suppressing it, because we are supposed to conquer the natural man, like you said, but it's not exactly what he was doing. It reminds me of when you have a problem in a relationship, and instead of dealing with the problem, whatever it is, you just ignore it, and you see that person again and again, you just ignore each other, and the conflict is still there, and it's eating away at both of you, but you don't address it, acknowledge it, and deal with it. So we have a side that's a natural man that we need to acknowledge exists, deal with in one form or another, but I don't know, you can correct me, kind of like a relationship, we have to come to terms with it, figure out what exactly we need to do to attain our goals of,
To compromise with it, to get
I
through
would
life
say
or
compromise.
So I can tell you exactly what we need to do with this.
Well,
It's
but-
found in Luke, it's found in Luke chapter 11, but we'll get there in just a minute.
Well, I was just gonna say, well, we were having, sorry, a little
Yeah, we had our own
sidebar, but he was
conversation.
saying, I think you
Well,
have to starve it in a way, I mean, Jekyll was feeding it. He was feeding that size, and, almost towards the end, the drawing of him, and I know that's not, but, the drawing of Hyde looks larger than it did in the beginning.
Well, he doesn't
In my
say-
book, at
Didn't the
least.
book
It
say
says
that he
that
does
specifically.
grow?
Grows,
Yeah, I
because,
thought it did.
because
That's what I was
Jekyll's
trying-
been feeding it, and I
Right.
think, the things that we feed are going to flourish, and so if I continue to feed my addictions, my foibles, my weaknesses, they are gonna become strengths, but not the kind of strengths I want them to be.
I think,
Right.
sorry.
No,
I was
but-
gonna say, I think one of the keys to that a lot of people miss, including some people I know who have made comments about like, oh, I'm gonna stop doing this bad thing, and I always feel like they're missing this, is that you can't just starve something and hold the food to yourself. When something's a part of you, all of your energy is going into yourself, and if you just try to hold back that energy, eventually it's gonna break back into what you have a habit of doing. So what you have to do is you have to not just starve the beast, you have to be feeding another part of yourself, or a new part of yourself, a new hobby to replace a bad one, a new food to replace a bad food,
Kinda like a
whatever,
lawn.
so that
Kinda
you
like
are.
Lawns, you have, and you can't just keep eliminating the weeds, you have to fertilize the good, increase the good, so that flourishes and overcomes.
And that's
the-
what Luke, that's exactly what I
Right,
was gonna talk
exactly
about.
what
Luke is
God
that's
would say.
It's what I call the remove it, replace principles.
Right.
When God, in Luke, when Jesus Christ casts out the devil, and his disciples are kind of excited about it, and Jesus basically says, okay, that's great that you're excited about this, but it's only half done. I've cast out the devil, and he says that now that spirit wanders in dry places, and he's gonna come back to this man and
That's
see.
right.
He's gonna come back and see, is this man available for me to get back
Right,
into?
is that vessel still open?
Right, and he says,
empty?
if he
Right,
finds
he has
it,
to fill it, if he finds it empty.
if he finds it empty, cleaned and garnished, he's gonna enter back into that man with 7 spirits worse than himself, and the state of that man will be worse than it was in the beginning. Because you have to, in removing the bad, you're leaving an empty space. And if you don't fill that with good, then the bad comes back. And the bad gets worse. And we see that with Mr. Hyde, right? the very first story we really get of Mr. Hyde is when he runs over the girl.
Yeah, and stomps the heck out
Right,
of
and
the
she
girl.
doesn't actually get hurt seriously, but just the way he does it really bothers people, and so they bring him back and they kind of force him to pay, you know, compensation stuff. So that's bad enough. But when
Before we go on real quick, I just feel like there's something symbolic about the idea of you're just trampling over somebody, that it's like the kind of, when you're in this kind of thing where you don't care about anyone, you just trample over whoever is in your way. So go
right,
ahead.
and that's what he was, but that's the same thing. So, but that becomes worse as he doesn't replace. So he does try to remove Mr. Hyde. He says so, and for months he goes without him. But then
But he doesn't replace it with anything.
he
good.
doesn't replace him with
Right.
anything good.
Right.
And when Hyde gets back in, what happens? His
Murder.
state is worse than it was in the beginning because he ends up murdering somebody, which is much worse than just running over a girl and trampling her.
Which was pretty bad in and of itself.
Yeah, that's bad enough. And yet, it becomes worse when we try to clean ourselves out, but we don't replace the bad. We have to replace the bad,
Replace
or
it
we
with something
cannot
righteous.
overcome the bad. So I think that's important. I want to make one other comment about being a caution about reading at the end of this book, because sometimes I think we read this book and we read the end of it, and Dr. Jekyll gives us a lot of insights about what's going on. But remember, Dr. Jekyll is also Mr. Hyde. And so
He's
you
not a
can't
reliable narrator.
believe that last section of the book fully. So for example, he does say, he says, Mr. Hyde was getting bigger. Nobody else notices that. In fact, when Mr. Hyde dies at the end, he looks just like Mr. Hyde. He hasn't changed to the housekeeper.
And they say he's wearing Dr. Jekyll's size of clothes that are way too
that are
big for him.
way too big for him. So just think about that. The very end of the book, you're reading Dr. Jekyll's perspective, and it is not a reliable narrative.
No, it's not.
And you notice that his narrative is different from the observations of Mr. Utterson and his other friends. Dr. Jekyll has his own observations. They're different from everybody else's observations. So just as you read the end of that book, take that, recognize, I think one of the things I think that was masterful that Robert Louis Stevenson did in this was he gave us a more of an empirical observation through the beginning of the book. And then at the end, he gives us the reality of Dr. Jekyll,
So out of
which is
curiosity-
not empirical, cannot be seen as an empirical observation. And so it's wonderful to be able to see how he has experienced that in his own reality, and how far his reality is from the realities of everybody else that's around him.
Out of curiosity, I just wanted to ask, if you were to guess about the narration, would you say that he was actually perceiving it totally differently, like he was seeing himself as bigger? Or do you feel like maybe he was lying, because in this last note, he was still kind of trying to excuse it and kind of be like, it was, Dr. Hyde was bigger, I couldn't fight it, and so, you know, it was just too much for me kind of things, in order to make himself continue to look even a little bit better to the people who were going to get this note, because that was always what was important to him as Dr. Jekyll.
What do you guys think?
I thought that when he said he was bigger, that I didn't think he meant in stature. I felt that he meant in his controlling. I didn't take it as.
Right, and I think that's what
Powerful.
Genevieve's getting at, it's more of, he's bigger in that he has more power, more strength, I can't fight it like I could in the beginning.
It's also possible that in bigger, he just meant that he was just thinking about it more. It took up more space in his mind, more of his time and his thoughts, and he just felt there was more Mr. Hyde than Dr. Jekyll, because that's how he separated himself.
Well, I think, you know, when we decide he is that he is not a reliable narrator, then I think we have to kind of take with a grain of salt that it may be the truth as Jekyll sees it, but it's probably not the truth as others might, as Utterson might see it, or anybody else, you know, if you had an omniscient presence and could kind of, you know, the omnipotent or omniscient narrator who kind of tells us the truth. You know, I don't know if I'm making sense, but
Yeah.
I think once we realize, oh, this is Jekyll, but he is writing about himself and this other side of himself that he's created, I think it's hard to believe everything. I think we have to take it with a grain of salt and.
Because whoever you are, when you write about yourself, you're
Yeah.
gonna be biased.
How can we not?
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is the truth as we see it. I mean, my truth is what I mean, it's my perspective, it's how I've experienced things, and so it's really, it is my truth, but as other people in my family might narrate a similar, you know, the same family story, it can be very different.
And that's why I like to use the word reality. It's my
Yeah,
reality.
it's my- that's
I
what I
always
think I was
think
trying to
of, you know, I have a context of the world and how it works, and that's my reality. God has a context of the world and how it works, and that's the truth. My reality is not the truth. Although my goal is, the more I live, the longer I live, the closer my reality becomes to God's truth. And so I like to think of each of us as my experience is my reality. And Dr. Jekyll, he's giving us his reality.
And some of our experience might be truth, but it's hard for
Yeah.
us to know for sure
Right. So some
what
of
part
our-
of the truth we have.
Exactly.
But the closer we get to God, the closer we get
The
to.
closer our reality is to God's reality, which is true.
And
So that's-
I guess a part of that reality that kind of clashed with truth was this idea that if nobody knew who he was, there wouldn't be any consequences for his actions, which is why he went and did these things as Mr. Hyde, which later clashed with the truth of, like, your actions have consequences when he ended up murdering somebody.
Actually, it clashed with it before when he walks over the girl and they make him pay a fine, and he has to connect, he wasn't prepared, so he has to connect it back to his own name, because he was expecting to just be able to do whatever he wanted, and then, truth, people are like, you can't just do that, you have to pay these people, and he's like,
I gotta throw Jekyll under the bus.
Right.
I actually think that's a really interesting point, that the very opening actual scene is about the idea of him having to have consequences. Because I do think the idea of wishing to divorce your actions from the consequences of your actions is a huge, important idea in the book. And it's important that it's shown right from the beginning that nobody's actions are without consequence.
did you want to say?
Responsible for the consequences.
Come enjoy this.
No comments?
Sorry, we're sideboarding again.
Sorry, she, go ahead.
Well, I just said you probably, in her line of work, or former line of work, where she's talked about, you know, parents not being able, are often, we want to divorce ourselves, that was, I don't know if we just said that, but divorce ourselves from the consequence, because, well, it was the drugs that made me do that, not,
Yeah.
that wasn't
I
really
would
me.
never let that happen to my babies. I would never do that.
but also.
But you don't read that, but they're like, well, that didn't happen because I don't remember it. When you're on Mass and Barbiturates, you don't remember anything.
Right.
Or not.
And so
Apparently.
Jekyll doesn't feel like Hyde is him. And yet, like, that's the whole point in the end, right, is that they
That's
are
what I was gonna
the
say.
same person.
Same person. How could he not know that? Because he acts like all the way up to the end of the book that he didn't think it was the same person. And it wasn't him. It was his alter ego, and it just manifested itself when he drank the fluid, which I think the fluid had nothing to do with it. Because I think I'm just look. I'm about 6 foot tall. How tall am I now? You know, I can make myself shorter. I can make, I've seen scientific work where people can change their physical looks with their minds. The psyche is so powerful that if you get into something that deep and then think you have made something that takes the evil away and it can go on out into the world or whatever, so delusional, it's kind of a book on insanity.
And I think
I think it's crazy in a bed bug.
I think there is also a human tendency to not want to admit
Oh, yeah.
that our worst part of ourselves are ourselves, and
That's why it's
I
hard to
know-
look at the mirror and look in the mirror.
And I know people who treat their families with anger and contempt and even violence and say, that wasn't me, that was the depression, or that was my bipolar, or that was my whatever.
The alcohol.
It was the alcohol, it was the this
Isn't
doing that to you,
a
it's not
com-
me.
Isn't that a common, like, abuser tactic as well, like a part of gaslighting, that is someone who will do something bad and then blame it on something around them, say, you know, it's because of, you know, like you said, like a lot of times a mental illness or a neurodivergence will say, well, it's not my fault that I did this to you, it's your fault because you triggered my trauma and it made me do this to you. And then of course cause the person to feel like they are at fault for getting hurt instead of the person is at fault for hurting them. Almost feels like he's kind of gaslighting himself into being like, you know, I want to do these things, but I don't want to admit that I want to do these things, so I'm going to do something that will kind of convince me that I can't help it, so that I can do it without feeling guilty, up until the point where it can't stop.
I thought one of the parts that I don't know if I have a comment on it, but I was really fascinated by the description of the graffiti being written all over the room and all over his books and things, that Hyde was writing graffiti to Dr. Jekyll.
I think Hyde hated
Yeah.
Dr. Jekyll.
Well, yeah.
The passion took
All
away his
over.
fun.
Well, Jekyll for a while had control over when Hyde could come out.
Yeah, he lost that pretty quick.
Kind of in the same way that like a rebellious teenager dislikes their parents, who doesn't let them go out and do whatever they want. Hyde kind of felt similarly towards Jekyll for locking him up.
You could also see it potentially as like when Dad was talking earlier about in Luke, where it talks about the devils coming in. If you think of it as, rather than just like a physical addiction, as kind of a spiritual thing with letting devils into your body, you can have a sense of once you're at the point where the devils are more powerful than the human, then of course those parts of you, that devil hates the human, because I mean that's basically all they are at this point. They're just hatred, and so they're going to lash out at literally whatever they can reach. And those bad parts of you actually are the same way in general. When you are doing things that make you miserable, you want everyone around you to be miserable. And because he was trying to lock himself in, he was the only person he had access to. So he would scribble all over the books and the walls and things and curse at himself because there was no one else to hit. There was no one else to attack anymore.
Well, and I do think Hyde really disdained the things that taught against his behavior. And that's what these are the books that Jekyll has. All these books that he has are books that are about good, you know, how to be a good person, you know, philosophies of life, religious texts, things like that. And Hyde really disdained those things. And so, yeah, he was just, you know, I was very fascinated with that section too. That what's amazing to me is how the author is able to take a very short book and condense it down and put so much in it and really capture, I think captures really well addiction. I think it captures mental health really well. But I think all of those things, the one thing that really stands out to me is this secret life, this secrecy. And that's the big issue with addiction, with pornography, with even just all of us have little things, anger, all of us have little things that we try to hide from the world. We don't want people to know about. We try to hide them. We try to keep them away. We have little secrets. And I think what he's showing us is
little secrets can become big problems.
Well, of course, we go back to the Bible, and that's why light exposes dark, and
Right.
where there is light, there can be no dark.
Right. Well, and when you think about that.
And that's why it has to be exposed, acknowledged.
Right.
The deep side, the secret side has to be exposed, has to be acknowledged, has to be brought into the light.
And it's also why Jekyll and Hyde cannot actually coexist. Because
One of them has to take over all the way. They
One of
can't
them-
just, he
right.
couldn't go on forever balancing between the two. It was inevitable
it was
that
either.
one of the two of them was going to win.
Because the devil owns the fence. You can't serve God or mammon. When you try to balance God and the devil, inevitably you fall to the devil.
Like that phrase, the devil owns the fence.
So you can't be a fence sitter.
Yeah, you can't be a fence sitter between the two.
May I introduce a slightly different topic in terms of the same book?
Yeah.
How do you guys feel like Jekyll's friends responded? Was their response good enough? How would you rate their response and reaction to what was going on with Dr. Jekyll?
That's
Were
a
they
good
helpful? Were they
question.
harmful?
That's a really good question.
I think they didn't know what to do because they had no idea that it was him. They thought at first he was
That's true.
being blackmailed by some
Crook.
crook that had something over him, and then when they finally, the one doctor, the other one, when he figured out what it was, he was so taken aback, he died.
Yeah.
Like his health just went downhill because he couldn't even imagine that Dr. Jekyll was really Mr. Hyde, and yeah.
Which, to be fair, might not have been particularly helpful, but I'm not sure we can totally blame him for it.
I felt like Mr. Utterson was pretty good at approaching Dr. Jekyll. He approached him several times, gave Dr. Jekyll an opportunity to.
Yeah, he did.
Well, he was a lawyer.
Yeah. So he gave Dr. Jekyll an opportunity multiple times to come clean, and there's not, there's not a whole lot you can do to Dr. Jekyll when you don't know. You're thinking, oh, he thought he was being blackmailed.
And when he went to him about being blackmailed, he said, "Oh no, I've got this."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like, but it probably is important in the story that he has this outlet, that there was always someone he could have gone to for help, and he never did because his secret was so important to him. In the end, the person he actually told first was the person who it hurt more to find out.
Because he couldn't, by professional whatever, he couldn't tell the secret.
Yeah, it's because he was
I
his
mean,
lawyer.
it ate him up because he could not share the secret.
I think it's important to the story, though, that there are friends, there are Mr. Utterson and Dr. Lanyon, because it gives you the sense that Dr. Jekyll has a real choice to make. I think if he didn't have any friends, the story might read like it's this inevitable tragedy where he's inevitably pulled into his evil, and there's no point
Because he had
at which
nowhere
there
to
was a
go.
choice or a thing. And having the friends there who are reaching out to him over and over gives you the sense that this didn't have to go this way. There was another direction. He could have turned to his friends and come clean and gotten help. And I think it's really important to it being a story that gives us a feeling of
That's me.
a feeling of this is something that I can learn from, I can gain from this experience. Although, I mean, I love a good tragedy too. I'm not saying that a tragic story would be a bad story. Well,
Not
I
those
mean,
mediocre ones.
well, like Hamlet, Oedipus
yeah.
Rex, like, there's
Romeo and
something,
Juliet, yeah.
there's something really powerful in the way a tragedy works itself out emotionally. So I'm not saying that just being pure tragedy would make it
But
a
that
bad
isn't
story.
what this story is meant to
Yeah,
be.
no, but this story has that kind of there but for the grace of God go I element to it. And it's really important, I think, structurally, for you as a reader to see moments where you think, oh, just tell your friends. Especially once you've read it and you know the end and you're reading it, like, just reach out to them, just do it now. So it's frustrating, but it's also important to see those as missed opportunities.
Well, and in relation to what Isaac was bringing up, I think a lot of us can find ourselves in Dr. Mr. Utterson and Dr. Lanyon when we are around friends who are, if we look at Dr. Jekyll as being mentally ill, you know, most of us are not qualified or even know the first thing about mental illness. And so we know that there is something wrong, but we don't know what it is or how to help it or even how to address it. So, you know, it's really a hard place to be in when you feel like a family member or a friend is suffering from some kind of mental illness, and you're afraid if you broach the topic that they'll hate you, or it'll make it worse, or they'll just deny it, or they'll run away. And so my heart kind of goes out to them when I think they think that Dr. Jekyll is mentally ill, has gone crazy in a way. And they just, I mean, the only thing they know, and what I do appreciate is Utterson just shows up. He just keeps showing up. And I really think that's the best thing we can do for anyone in our lives, is just keep showing up.
And if I can add to that, you know, it may be a mental illness, or it may just be a bad decision. Somebody's just making bad decisions, and sometimes we don't know what to do. And I'll tell you, I work with a lot of parents who, when their children become adults and they start making bad decisions, and parents come to me and they're like, "What can I do? And they want to do these controlling things. They want to be like, I need to go tell them." I'm like, "No, you don't. No, you don't. Be there for them." And that's what I think. Again, Mr. Utterson was always there for him, and I think that's a really good. I actually, the more I think about it, the more I think Mr. Utterson did a great job. Now, Dr. Lanyon, interestingly, 10 years earlier, stopped communication with Dr. Jekyll altogether because of the decisions and choices Dr. Jekyll was making. He specifically says he didn't like it. They haven't been in contact for 10 years. The first time they're in contact in 10 years is when he asks him to get the drawer from his office with all the materials to make the potion, the concoction.
Didn't maybe that was because the lack of contact meant that it was actually kind of a more hidden, safer route than going to someone who maybe would have been able to help him more, but would have been a part of his everyday life that he was having to deal with afterwards?
I think that's possible. I think it's also very possible that he went to Dr. Lanyon because he was angry at Dr. Lanyon for not sticking with him, and you get that revenge piece there when he says, when Hyde gets the concoction, and he says, "Now I can take this home and I can do this in a different place, or I can do it here and you will see." And he's very, very mean about it. And then when Dr. Lanyon's like, "Well, no, I've come this far, I need to see this through." And then of course he goes mad and ends up dying as a result of it, but I think that was intentional. Dr. Jekyll was intentionally rubbing this in, being
trying to say, "Hey,
to
you
Dr.
abandoned
Lanyon.
me and look what happened to me."
So maybe you have a good friend who sticks with him and keeps showing up and keeps being there, and you have his other longtime friend who, when he first started getting into trouble, was like, I don't want to be part of your life anymore.
Right. Rather than saying, "I'm not going to be a part of the choices you're making, but I'll still be there for you," he instead just completely abandoned him 10 years prior.
But to play devil's advocate, because I have family members that have chosen, and I do not speak to them. I do not. And it is from my mental health and the safety of my children. So that could have been the doctor's viewpoint too, is I
Sure.
can't, and then even in the work that I did before, there were times where they've been like, okay, family members have been like, we've done everything we can, and we would love to take their children, but we can't, because we know what the effects will be on our family.
On a note of that, it doesn't necessarily negate the earlier point. It could be that he chose to not be a particularly good friend because friendship, despite the magic of friendship messages we tend to get a lot right now, is not the most important relationship. Your relationship to God is the most important, and then to your spouse and your children, etc. When you have a friendship that falls lower on the list of importance in your relationships in your life, and it's getting in the way of those other relationships, to your relationship to God, it's toxic and damaging. Sometimes you have to say, I love you, but I can't be a good friend, because being a good friend to you is less important than being a good mother or being a good child of God.
And I've definitely had clients where I've had to help them separate themselves from it. I've had clients where I've had to help them separate themselves from family members who are from parents who are a very negative influence in their life, and is not going to be positive for anybody. So I agree with that assessment. It's possible that Dr. Lanyon, and you see what the effect is when he does invite Dr. Jekyll back into his life. It is detrimental it's so detrimental that he ends up actually dying as a result of that reconnection. So maybe Dr. Lanyon had made the right choice in the beginning, and should maybe have said, when given that note, said, I'm sorry, but this is not something I can participate in. I've already broken that connection, because that connection is detrimental to my spiritual, physical, and mental health. And so it's very possible that Dr. Lanyon agreeing to do what Dr. Jekyll asked him to do is what was wrong, and that the initial separation was the right choice.
And it could just be that they had different abilities. Like, it seems like maybe Mr. Utterson had a stronger constitution. He could handle more of it because he makes those right decisions, and he's able to be there at the end, and he has the plan for catching Mr. Hyde and everything, and then maybe Dr. Lanyon just didn't have that constitution to be able to handle it, and he knew that, so he set that boundary, but then walked back on it to his demise.
Now, I don't think there's any evidence in the book to back this up, but in kind of the same vein of what happens in real life, it's entirely possible that Dr. Jekyll's idea was so dangerous, and Dr. Lanyon found it so revolting because he found it tempting, and didn't want to end up getting trapped himself in the same thing that Jekyll ended up trapped in. There's definitely something that happens when you have somebody who's trapped in some bad choices they've made, that you want to stay away from it because you don't want to make those choices yourself.
Especially because he had been directly involved, unlike Mr. Utterson, who just, he's like, can I help you? And then Dr. Jekyll turns him away until he eventually gets the note at the end. He actually asks Dr. Lanyon to go and get the drugs or whatever it is for him. So he's actively involved in not only being there for his friend, but as a part of this secret. And I think part of the thing that might have been so revolting for him could also have been not only knowing this happened to my friend and this is what my friend is, but having some sense of his own hands being dirty, of, I, even for a brief period of time, was a part of this, and that makes it a part of me now.
Kind of thing I took away from the whole book too was when I got finished with it, and I'm sitting there on the couch, I thought, it sounds a whole lot like New York City. You know, I mean, because, you know, they're pushing people into subways, they're beating people on the street, there's a lot of hides up there. And I think the book is good in the respect that it highlights mental illness, and that it's imperative that we find a way to help these people and to save us. Get them off the street, open up the institutions again, because some of these people can't be free, just can't, because they're going to hurt people,
right?
And they just can't help it.
It's kind of funny
But
that
we
you.
just can't get that discussion in this country going for that.
Right.
It's kind of funny that you compare it specifically to New York, just because the kind of glamorous idea of New York that I've heard a lot of times is the idea of you go to New York and you become a new person. You go to New York and it doesn't matter who you were before. You get to wear this special mask and have a made-up name and be in the limelight. And then, of course, New York went to heck with all people hiding behind their masks, and you have all the fancy people who couldn't care less who's getting walked over in the streets down there because they have guards around their houses. You know, not to be political.
Not to be political, but
Not
in
to
a
be
political
political,
sense.
but houses politics.
Yeah.
But there's a good point to that, but I think we can see that in our own community. I think every community is in and of itself a entity that has these two sides, that has this really nice,
Respectable.
attractive, respectable side, but also has this side
See,
with
under that.
violence and crime, and we have it here in Monette and Pierce City and Cassville and Mount Vernon and Aurora. It's not like we're somehow immune from that. We have that. Those things are happening here. And I think Tony, you were talking about the work that you do, and sometimes these people who look so well put together, and we don't realize that actually they're some of the people who are struggling.
Mm.
And if we could catch them early, they wouldn't be in a chicken coop.
Yeah.
Right?
And the thing is too, like, it's a circle. It really, really is. And I know a lot of people are like, well, you removed the kids, terminated the rights on the parents, and the kids are adopted into nice families. And I actually had guardianship of my now daughter-in-law when she was younger, and she was in foster care the whole 9 yards, and she came to my home. Now she's my daughter-in-law, and I have 3 beautiful grandchildren and another one on the way. And but when she got a certain age, that pull from the biological family was so great, and I sat her down and said, listen, this is what will happen. And then again, when she had my first grandchild, her and my son, I sat them both down and said, listen, if you start going down that road, the child will be mine and you will never see him again, because that is the way it will be. And there will be no pull. He will not know you exist, because a lot of when kids are adopted and they turn 16, 17, 18, they want that mom and or that dad, and they have not, 9 times out of 10, they have not changed. They've proceeded to have more children, and those have been taken away, and more children, and those have been taken away, until finally something happens and they're unable to have children, or I'm not gonna say the state gets involved, but their attorney may be like, listen, you should maybe do something so this doesn't happen anymore. But the pull is so great, they go back. And a lot of times they just start that cycle all over again. So even though mom was a beautiful woman and a bank teller, and her son was taken away, if he is not put in a home where all of those needs are met, and yes, this was your mom, this is what happened, this is why you're with us, and they're not honest about the whole thing, he can start that cycle all over again.
Right.
And it's not, Children's Division, they have not found a good thought out plan as to 1, how to stop the cycle, or 2, every time a child is removed, and granted, like the little boy who was living in the chicken coop with his mom, and I'm talking, it was a chicken coop. Even though he was in a home where they loved him, I mean, this family was one of the best foster families I ever had the privilege to work with. they protected him, they loved him, he still had that draw. He still had the trauma of being removed from his mom, who he had lived with in the nice big house, and then the chicken coop, and then the man that the property that they lived on. He was not kind man. He was not a kind man. Terrorized the little boy by scaring him with demonic things. So he had nightmares and stuff, but even though he still wanted his mom, he still wanted that because he was still drawn to it. So that's one of the reasons why I love Children's Division, is because there is not a good, a lot of times when people get into the drugs, it's because they have their own trauma and they can't cope with their own trauma. But the mental health that is available to them is horrible.
Right.
It's lacking in ways that you can't even imagine, because the state is paying for their mental health. They're like, oh yeah, you get to go to this therapist, this psychiatrist, and instead of working through that trauma, they're like, well, let's put you on these meds.
Right.
So it's just replacing a med with another med.
Or you only get 6 weeks.
You only get 6 weeks and then you're done. And that doesn't help. And that they are not in any way, shape, or form breaking the cycle. I have only one family that I know of my years doing that, where when I left, she broke the cycle. She got her kids back, but that woman went to, the case was 6 months long. She went to 133 NA meetings. She went before she went to work, she went on her lunch break, and she went after work.
Wow.
And she
wanted it.
She wanted it, but she also had a family that was trying to help her in the best way they could, but she wanted it. But
Unlike Dr. Jekyll, who,
Yeah,
when
who didn't really
he
want it.
says, I'm gonna get rid of Mr. Hyde, he holds on to the house, and he holds on to the clothes, and he holds on to this was a woman who really was willing to let go of all of the things that would pull her back into the cycle. And that's how she was able to go, because she let go of those things, and she replaced them with better things that would improve her life. And she had to continue doing that. One of the things I think sometimes we forget, we're just about out of time, but one of the things that I think that is easy to forget is that we have to keep replacing. You can't stop.
Yeah.
You can't say,
rest a second.
you can't say, okay, I've got this, I'm done. We're never done. We're never done. And as soon as you think, I'm done, guess what happens? You're right back at the beginning. You go right back. I see this with people who try weight loss. They get to the weight they want to be at, and they're like, great, I'm done.
Pizza.
And you don't know. It takes no time to get back to where you started. Or like we talked about in Luke 11, you become heavier than you were in the beginning, because they're not recognizing that this is a lifelong battle. This is a lifestyle change. Whatever it is that we're trying to change, and it doesn't matter what it is, it's a lifestyle change, and that means we have to keep the change going for a lifetime.
It's almost like putting patching a hole in a boat. Your boat has a hole in it, you're sinking, you patch the hole and you bail out the water. You can't just say, oh, well, there's no more water in the boat, I can take the patch out now.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I just kind of had a thought, while we were talking about how fascinated we've become, like, as a culture, with the true crime podcasts and the docu-series and the dramatization of serial killers and things like that. And it's making me kind of think about this and how it's like, finding ways to feed that, indulge that side of ourselves. It's like, oh, well, this is sanitized because I'm not doing it, but you're feeding it into your mind, and I'm thinking that that's something that's not so good. It's-
Sounds just like Dr. Jekyll, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it,
I'm
Mr.
not
Hyde
doing it.
is.
Not my fault.
And we can do the same thing with video games,
Anything.
television, music,
I
but
have a
we can
friend-
bring those things into our lives, and then we can say, but I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
But you're inviting that into your life and into your home. Yeah, I agree. I think it's very dangerous, some of the things that we invite into our home.
Okay, Genevieve, and then I'm gonna make a closing
I
thought.
was just going to add to that and say, I have a friend who, has like violent urges sometimes that she's had like her whole life, and I was like, oh, how do you cope with that? And she's like, I make fake blood in the bathtub and dump it all over the place, and it makes me feel better because I can see blood, but it's not real blood. And I remember when she first told me that, and I was like,
Yeah.
so you maybe want to not do that. It sounds like a really good way to get yourself into a situation where someone's getting hurt.
So we come up with a better coping mechanism.
So, my closing thought is about Halloween. I think we picked this book for this month partially because this is the month of Halloween, and so we wanted something that's kind of scary and spooky and Halloweeny. And I've been thinking about this a lot for the last couple of days because one of my brother-in-laws posted on Facebook a couple days ago an anti-Halloween post, and he said everything about Halloween and the way we celebrate it is antithetical to being a disciple of Christ.
Uh-huh.
And so I've been thinking about that because I like Halloween and I didn't want to be like a not good disciple of Christ. And I've been reading a lot of scary books this month. And so my thought was, you know, kind of wrapping up our discussion about the nature of evil, that there's this progression in the holiday season. And I tend to think of Halloween as leading into Thanksgiving, which leads into Christmas. And so if you think of Halloween in terms of this is a time where we face the nature of evil and good versus evil, and we think a lot about what evil is. And we look, maybe even we look at the evil inside of ourselves. Then we're preparing our hearts for the time where we can be repentant and grateful. We can express gratitude for all of the mercy, the undeserved mercy and generosity that the Lord is putting on us. And that prepares our heart for welcoming in Christ, who brings light in the darkness. And the darkness starts first so that we can see the light that shines in darkness, that comes in the, I think it's really symbolically important that Christmas comes in the darkest time of the year, that we have the light that illuminates the darkness. And so I don't know how you guys all feel about Halloween, and it doesn't really matter, but I feel justified in my liking of thinking about, I think it's okay to think about evil and dark and scary things if we use it to point ourselves towards
Channel
Christ.
to righteousness.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that there aren't bad ways to celebrate spookiness and evil that can be not helpful, but as we've been talking about the evil within, I just want to leave with the thought that the only way really to conquer the evil within us is to turn towards Christ. And I hope that as we go through moving into the rest of this holiday season, that all of us will be turning our faces toward the light and using it to illuminate and eradicate the darkness inside us
Get rid
and
of
help
our
us
hide.
spread light into our communities. So that's my closing thought. Do you have a closing thought?
Have you chosen a book for November? I know we talked about December, but is there?
Yeah, so we discussed a couple of
We
books.
discussed a couple, so we don't have our books settled on for November yet. We will put it on the website. However, if you wanna take just a minute, we could discuss it here, and maybe as a group, we could decide what we wanna do between the ones that you have.
So November, this weekend in November will be right after Thanksgiving. Seth wants to still do it this anyway, even if there's not a lot of people available, just so that it's setting up a pattern and that there's people who are looking at, like, this is the, what is it, the fourth Saturday of the month?
Fourth Saturday
The fourth
of the month,
Saturday of the
yep.
month, we're gonna do this. A couple suggestions that we had were, one is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, as a book to think about. That is not too long, but really gives you intense feelings of gratitude and thinking about, you know, how can I be grateful in hard times?
Speaking of difficult books. It's a fantastic
It's
book. I
fantastic
absolutely love
book.
it. Anyways, what were
Uh,
other thoughts that you had?
What, I'm trying to remember what the other ones were, because I remember Man's Search for Meaning was the one I wanted to do, and you said maybe I should come up with a fiction alternative because you weren't sure you wanted to do nonfiction, and I don't remember what the fiction ones we discussed were. I just
I
remember
think The
Man's Search for Meaning.
Sojourner could be a good fall book, reminds me of The Harvest and.
Okay, yeah, by Marjorie Keenan Sprawley. Yeah.
We did it several years ago.
Yes, she's the author of The Yearling, whatever her name is, Marjorie.
I don't wanna do The Yearling,
Rollins.
but The Sojourner.
No, but it's the same author.
So that would be a good one. Another thought that I had was something that I really love is children's books. And children's books there's a lot of just really beautiful, just meaning, deep meaning in some of those children's books. And I frequently have assign people to read children's books like The Trumpet of the Swan, Charlotte's Web.
The Wheel on the School,
The
that's
Wheel
what
on the
you use a
School,
lot.
The Wheel on the School I use a lot. So that's kind of where my mind was going, maybe a children's book for November that is, again, points to gratitude and whatnot, but also very easy, a very simple read, but I think a very deep and
Especially because it's
meaningful
gonna come during a busy weekend, it might be something,
Yeah.
that we probably don't wanna like read Great Expectations this month.
I want to read Great Expectations every month. I love Great Expectations.
Great Expectations isn't such a great book about gratitude, though. I mean, a little bit, but it's more a great book about.
Yeah, yeah,
being a
pretty
little
much.
bit.
And so do you guys, the rest of you, have any thoughts?
I like the idea of reading a children's book. I just read Heidi the other day. It's a good one for gratitude. They do a lot of gratitude in it. It's also way shorter than I remembered from when I was a kid.
What was the name of the other book, The Man's Search for Happiness?
Man's Search for
That's a
Meaning by
very good-
Viktor Frankl.
It's a true story, too.
It's,
Oh, yeah.
it's a Holocaust narrative, and Viktor
Written from
Frankl
Jewish point of view.
then became a psychologist after the Holocaust and developed this psychological theory based on his idea that people can't take away from you
That's right.
your will.
Yeah.
You always have your will, no
Can't get
matter
to your
what people
core.
take care of.
There's an old one, if we're gonna do mental, and it's from my childhood, I think I still have it, and it's probably falling apart. But there's one that deals specifically with mental illness, and it's called The Moonraker's Bride, and it's very fictitious.
I've heard of that.
Well, actually, I might not have it, I think I borrowed it to someone and I never got it back.
Isn't that frustrating when
Well,
that happens?
I wrote my name in it too.
I lent one of my wife's books out once,
Uh-oh.
and
Just the one
it never
time.
came
Well,
back, and she was
one
very
specifically
upset.
that was a first edition that I was really had.
But then Genevieve bought it for Christmas later.
I need to add that to my Goodreads. We will definitely look up and read The Moonraker's Bride. I
it
think
is
Seth
very-
Seth wants to choose for this book club a book that he has read already beforehand.
Probably.
Yeah.
We'll-
But I
Man's Search
but
for
we will
Meaning is not
definitely-
as short
we'll
as Hides, but it's still
Yeah,
not
and
short.
no, it doesn't
book.
have to be super, short. I'm just thinking,
For this particular time of year, it's better to go shorter.
I think though, that a mental health book, like you're talking about, would probably be maybe an ideal book for January or February, those are the 2 months where we have the
Most
most
suicides and
mental
mental health problems.
problems. That might be a really good time, but I'm going to look that book up and I'm gonna read it.
It has been
a long time since I read it, but it was one of the books that I've read multiple, and I couldn't tell you who the author is. or when it was
Peter
written.
O'Donnell.
Oh, you looked it up?
It's where she's
Moonraker's
in
Bride.
China, in a mission in China,
Yeah.
with small children.
Yep.
I'm seeing Moonraker's Bride by Madeline Brent, so it's not that.
It might be, she's in an orphanage in China and then
Born
she
in a
has to
mission in
marry-
China, Lucy Waring finds herself with 15 small children to feed and care
And
for.
who does your author say?
Madeline Brent.
Mine says book by Peter O'Donnell, same description.
Maybe
very
she used
Well, talk about Jekyll and Hyde.
Exactly. Maybe she used a pen name originally and then it was released later under the.
Like I said, Jekyll and Hyde.
I'm seeing
Madeline Brent is
when I
a
look it up.
pseudonym used by Peter O'Donnell.
Okay then.
See, I told you.
There we go.
That's interesting because just side note, it's much more common to have a female write under a male pseudonym.
Yeah,
than
I
a
was
man
totally assuming that it
write
was the
under
girl
a
writing.
female
it.
No, I had never thought about that. Really? That's the truth?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's
Historically, that's the truth.
It didn't was it Jane Austen or, no, who was it that?
well, the
she-
Brontes wrote under male names,
Yes.
and so did George Eliot, who was Marianne Evans, or yeah,
O'Connor.
yeah.
Well, because they have a better chance of being published and taken seriously.
Oh, is that what it
Back
is?
in the day.
Yeah.
And even somebody like J.K. Rowling of the Harry Potter books wrote under the initials rather than under her name because it looked more masculine to just have initials in it. Anyway, that's
So-
totally aside.
So we will have a book picked out. It will be on the website. Our website is atwaterhealing.com if you want to go to our website. And we will have the book listed on there sometime this week. We'll get it up by the end of this coming week. And we're gonna try, I'm gonna try to have books,
Several months
3
ahead.
months ahead. So as we finish this one, the idea would be, we would already have November, December, and then as we finish this one, we would be announcing January. So probably sometime in the next week or two, we'll probably announce both November and January. We've already announced, December. But we'll put that on our website also, so that you know.
We are.
Oh, I always
The
do.
fourth is Christmas Eve.
I won't be here.
That's okay. I've done a book club thing on the fourth week of the fourth Saturday of December multiple times. And that's almost always my
But
biggest
it's not
weekend.
usually Christmas Eve, so we could maybe
The
do
fourth
the
week
Friday.
isn't Christmas
Yes,
Eve.
it is.
Yeah, at least that's why we're saying
So we can
Christmas
jack
Eve.
with the date a little bit.
Sure, yeah, we'll do the next one, whatever the next Saturday is.
That would
The
be
New
fifth
Year's
Saturday.
New Year's Eve.
So you might wanna just trade it to the Friday.
Oh, we might just trade it to Friday.
Yeah.
That
That's where I was.
But don't let us be surprised, be sure and tell us.
We
Yeah.
will.
Yeah, we'll just, the thing is, we're gonna do it, we may even do that one in the middle of the week, almost everybody is off, between
Alright.
Christmas and New Year's, so
So
we
thank
might
you
do that
for
one in the middle of the week,
coming.
we'll do it the last week of December, one way or the other. Hey, thank you guys so much, this has been a lot of fun, I feel
you.
like, we had a lot of good comments, I really appreciate that.
It was enjoyable.
I
Thank
think
you.
as we keep going, we'll probably get more people coming. Hopefully we won't get too many more, so we don't
Wait,
crowd ourselves out, but
Well,
maybe that's true.
there's-
Yeah.
It-
There's the
It would be good to
optimism.
have, it's good to have a big, it's good to have a big group. At a certain point then,
I, she said that.
Then we'll just, we'll
discussion
format it.
goes a little.
Yeah, we'll just format it a little differently, that's
It
okay.
didn't work.
But anyways, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. We will
Thanks for
see you.
giving us your time.
Just a reminder, the 12th of November, we're going to
Which
be
is
doing
2
a
weeks from
family
today.
dance, a family community dance,
That
and
is- are we in
we
November?
always.
November 12th. It's-
November 12th.
Yeah, it's the day after Veterans Day, and we're gonna do a World War II theme.
dance.
Yes.
Yes.
With like big band music and swing dance.
And that's for all ages.
That's
It's
okay.
10,
You
again,
can
it's
come
$10
listen to the music and have
per
refreshments.
person,
There you go.
or if
There
you're
you go.
bringing a whole family, it's $30 for a whole family, so. And then we always have our
We're
third
gonna have
Friday
dance
of the
instruction
month
in the
date
first
night.
half hour if people want to have a little dance instruction.
We also will continue to have our third Friday of the month date night, and Ann Bryan will be in charge of our date night for November. We won't have a date night in December, that one we are going to skip.
Alright.
That'll be good.
You could possibly move the book club up a week if you're not doing date night in November, or do your book club in December, the week before Christmas.
We'll make a decision.
If you're a reader,